With it being so long in a 2-year stretch, it seemed like it was never going to happen. It's a rush of so many feelings right now, but it's unimaginable because we never thought that it would happen.
Butts' sentencing is scheduled 1 month from now. That's March 12th at noon, right back here at the 3rd Circuit Courthouse, where we'll be waiting for answers to what exactly
There's a specific kind of rage that comes from watching someone walk away from what they deserve. Not the hot, immediate kind that makes you want to scream. The cold, calculating rage that sits in your chest like a stone and makes you question whether justice actually exists. On a Tuesday morning in a Detroit courtroom, Annette Harris felt that rage consume her as she watched the man who murdered her 13-year-old granddaughter accept a plea deal that would give him the possibility of freedom. 35 to 60 years. That's what 13-year-old Ziyah Harris's life was worth in the eyes of the law. And the most haunting part? The man who took her gets to breathe, eat, sleep, and possibly walk free one day. Ziyah never will. Here's what makes this unbearable. Jarvis Butts didn't just kill a child. He systematically groomed her, controlled her, made her believe he loved her while destroying her innocence piece by piece. And when she became pregnant with his child at 13 years old, he made her disappear. 2 years, 1 month, and 3 days after Ziyah vanished, her body has never been found. Yet somehow, the justice system decided that telling the truth about her body, not even revealing its location, just providing a truthful statement, was worth avoiding a life sentence. If that makes you furious, you're not alone. If it makes you question how we protect children in this country, especially Black girls whose disappearances don't generate nationwide manhunts and primetime specials, then you're paying attention. Because this case isn't just about one monster and one murdered child. It's about every system that failed Ziyah before Jarvis Butts ever touched her. It's about the family members who looked away, the adults who knew something was wrong but stayed silent, the prosecutors who decided a plea deal was better than fighting for the life sentence this case demanded. Subscribe because this story will destroy you. And it should. Because somewhere right now, another 13-year-old girl is being groomed by a man everyone trusts. Another family is missing red flags they'll regret ignoring for the rest of their lives. And another predator is calculating whether the risk is worth it. This is the story of how ordinary evil destroys extraordinary potential, and why Ziyah Harris deserved so much more than the justice she received. Ziyah Harris should be 15 years old right now. She should be worried about algebra homework and basketball practice and which shoes to wear to school. She should be experiencing her first real crush, the kind that makes your stomach flip when you see them in the hallway. She should be fighting with her grandmother about her phone usage and rolling her eyes at family dinners and dreaming about her future in ways that seem impossibly far away when you're 15 but arrive faster than you ever imagine. Instead, Ziyah has been missing since January 9, 2024. And everyone who knew the case understood within weeks that missing meant dead. Because when a 13-year-old girl disappears, and the man she was last seen with is a 41-year-old registered sex offender who had unlimited access to her for years, the math isn't complicated. The only questions were how, when, and whether her body would ever be found. But before we talk about her death, we need to understand her life. Because Ziyah wasn't just a victim. She was a child with a personality, with dreams, with a laugh that people who knew her still hear in their quietest moments. She loved doing hair, watching YouTube tutorials, and practicing braiding techniques on anyone who would sit still long enough. She was into fashion in that specific way 13-year-old girls are, where suddenly fake nails and lip gloss feel like the most important things in the universe because they represent becoming someone new, someone older, someone in control of how the world sees you. She had been adopted by her grandmother, Annette Harris, who loved her fiercely but was fighting an impossible battle. Because Ziyah came from chaos, a mother who couldn't care for her, a father who was absent, a family system so fractured that a registered sex offender could become a permanent fixture in her life, and nobody stopped it. Annette tried. But how do you compete with a predator who has been grooming a child since she was small enough to think his attention meant love? Here's what people don't understand about grooming. It's not a sudden thing. It's not a stranger in a van offering candy. It's someone familiar, someone trusted, someone who has been woven into the fabric of your life so completely that questioning them feels like questioning reality itself. For Ziyah, that person was Jarvis Butts. And the reason he had such easy access to her is the kind of detail that makes your skin crawl. He shared 5 children with Ziyah's maternal aunt, Shannon. Think about that structure for a moment. Jarvis Butts wasn't some random predator who spotted Ziyah on the street. He was family, not by blood, but by the modern definition of family that includes baby daddies and exes and complicated relationships that keep people orbiting each other for years. He had been in Ziyah's life since she was small. He was Uncle Jarvis, the guy who showed up at family gatherings, who gave the kids money for doing chores, who positioned himself as a mentor to the neighborhood children. And people loved him for it. That's the part that haunts the community still. Jarvis Butts presented himself as a positive male role model in a neighborhood where those are precious and rare. He hired kids to clean up his shop. He paid them $25 each, money that felt significant to children who didn't have much. He talked to them about school, about earning what you want, about appreciating opportunities. Parents saw him as helpful. Kids saw him as generous. And all the while, he was selecting his victims. Ziyah was his favorite. Everyone who paid attention knew it, even if they didn't name what they were seeing. He bought her things, clothes, fake nails, little gifts that made her feel special. He paid attention to her in ways the adults in her life didn't. He made her feel seen, heard, important. He created a relationship where she depended on him emotionally, where his approval became the thing she sought most in the world. And then he made it sexual. The exact timeline of when Jarvis Butts began sexually abusing Ziyah may never be fully known, but the evidence suggests it had been happening for years before her disappearance. By the time she was 13, the abuse had escalated to the point where Ziyah became pregnant. 13 years old and pregnant by a 41-year-old man who was already on the sex offender registry for previous crimes against children. Let that sink in for a moment. Jarvis Butts was already a known predator. He was already being monitored by the system, already marked as someone who had sexually abused children before. And still, he had unsupervised access to Ziyah. Still, he was welcomed into family spaces. Still, nobody stopped him. The text messages between Jarvis and Ziyah in the days before she disappeared are almost unbearable to read. She's a child trying to process the reality that she might be pregnant, reaching out to the man who did this to her, because he's the only person she feels she can talk to. And his responses are calculated, controlling, grooming her even in those final messages. "You said that you took a pregnancy test, and it was negative," he texts her. "It did," she replies. The grammar, the phrasing, it's a child's text message, written by someone who should be worried about TikTok trends and friend drama, not pregnancy tests and the rage of a predator who realizes his victim's pregnancy could expose him. "So go get another one," he demands. "I can't. I have no money," she tells him, The words heavy with the helplessness of a child who depends on her abuser for everything, even the pregnancy test that might confirm what he's done to her. "You go get one," she adds, a flicker of the assertiveness she should have been developing at her age if her childhood hadn't been stolen. And that's where the messages stop. Because sometime very soon after that exchange, Jarvis Butts made a decision. He decided that Ziyah pregnant was a problem that needed to be eliminated. And on January 9th, 2024, Ziyah Harris vanished. The timeline of that day remains murky, filled with the kind of contradictions that drive investigators insane. What's known as this: Ziyah was last seen in the area of her grandmother's home in Detroit. Multiple witnesses placed her going back and forth to a neighbor's house, where someone was braiding her hair in the basement. She was excited about her hair getting done. That specific kind of excitement teenage girls get about beauty rituals that make them feel grown, make them feel pretty, make them feel in control of at least one small aspect of their lives. Jarvis Butts was also in the area that day. He later admitted to police that he saw Ziyah while her hair was being done, saw her going back and forth between houses. In his version of events, that was the last time he saw her alive. Just a casual encounter with a family member's kid while she was getting her hair braided. Nothing suspicious. Nothing that would explain why she would disappear hours later and never be seen again. But here's what investigators know that Jarvis didn't expect them to find: his phone records, his vehicle movements, his desperate attempts in the hours and days after Ziyah vanished to control the narrative and destroy evidence. Because Jarvis Butts is a predator, but he's not a criminal mastermind. He's a man who thought he was smarter than the police, smarter than the family searching for Ziyah, smarter than the digital footprint that follows everyone in 2024 no matter how careful they think they're being. The investigation into Ziyah's disappearance began immediately, but the early days were chaos. In missing children cases, the first 48 hours are critical, the window where the chances of finding them alive drop precipitously with each passing minute. But this case had complications from the start. Ziyah was a black girl from a struggling neighborhood, the kind of case that doesn't generate the same media frenzy as a missing white child from the suburbs. The family dynamics were complicated, with multiple relatives giving conflicting accounts of when they last saw her and what her state of mind had been. And perhaps most critically, nobody wanted to believe that Jarvis Butts, good old helpful Jarvis who hired neighborhood kids and acted like a mentor, could be capable of murder. But investigators knew something the family didn't. Jarvis Butts was already on their radar for recent sexual assault allegations involving other young girls. Multiple victims had come forward describing a pattern of behavior identical to what he had done with Ziyah, befriending them, gaining their trust, giving them money and gifts, isolating them, and then sexually abusing them. The charges hadn't been filed yet when Ziyah disappeared, but detectives were building cases against him that would eventually include 6 counts of criminal sexual assault involving minors. When Ziyah vanished, those detectives immediately zeroed in on Jarvis. And what they found in those first crucial hours was damning. He was panicking. The calm, controlled predator who had successfully groomed and abused children for years was suddenly making frantic phone calls, giving contradictory statements, and behaving in ways that screamed consciousness of guilt. Within days of Ziyah's disappearance, Jarvis Butts turned himself into police. Not because he wanted to confess, because he knew they were coming for him, and he wanted to control the narrative of his arrest. He wanted to walk into that police station, looking like a man with nothing to hide, a man willing to cooperate, a man who couldn't possibly have harmed a child he thought of as family. The interrogation that followed is a masterclass in watching a predator squirm. You can read the transcript of those hours and see Jarvis trying every manipulation tactic he's ever used on children, now deployed against experienced homicide detectives who have seen every con and heard every lie. He's cooperative but evasive, helpful but controlling, volunteering information that seems transparent while carefully avoiding anything that might incriminate him. The detectives ask him about his relationship with Ziyah, and he positions himself as a mentor. She was one of many neighborhood kids he tried to help, he explains. He'd hire them to do odd jobs, cleaning up a shop, running errands, and pay them so they'd learn about earning money and responsibility. It wasn't favoritism with Ziyah. He treated all the kids the same. Well, Maybe he was a little more patient with her because she was Shannon's niece, family by extension, but nothing inappropriate. Never anything inappropriate. He acknowledges seeing her on January 9th, admits he was in the area when she went missing. But his version is casual, insignificant. He saw her getting her hair done, maybe said hi, maybe didn't even interact with her directly. The timeline is vague in his telling, the details fuzzy in ways that give him room to adjust his story if evidence contradicts him later. The detectives press him about his phone. They want to see his messages with Ziyah, want to track his movements on the day she disappeared through cell tower data and GPS. And this is where you can watch Jarvis start to panic in the transcript. He volunteers his phone password 041925, his birthday, acting like a man with nothing to hide. But then he adds that the phone isn't with him anymore. His girlfriend Angel has it. Or maybe the police already seized it in a raid on her house. He's not sure. He's been locked up and out of touch. He can't be expected to know where his phone is or what evidence might be on it. The detectives ask about his car, a tan sedan registered to Angel. Where was it on January 9th? Who was driving it? Would he consent to a search? Again, Jarvis is cooperative in theory, evasive in practice. Of course they can search it. He has nothing to hide. But also, he's not sure where the car is now, not sure what condition it's in, not sure if Angel might have cleaned it or moved it or done something with it in the weeks since Ziyah vanished. And then there's the phone call from jail. Because Jarvis, like so many criminals who think they're smarter than the system, forgot that jail calls are recorded. The conversation with his friend is casual on the surface, asking about putting money on his commissary account, complaining about quarantine in county jail, the kind of mundane details that fill incarcerated people's phone calls. But embedded in that casual conversation are instructions that make investigators' hearts race. "I need you to call Angel," Jarvis tells his friend. "Get that truck up there and get my phone out that back seat." The friend confirms. "Under or in the back seat?" "In the back," Jarvis specifies. "Right in the middle of that back seat, bro. Soon as you reach behind that back seat, approximately straight in the middle." It's evidence destruction in real time. Jarvis knows there's something on or in that car that will destroy him, knows the police will eventually get a warrant to search it, knows his only chance is to have someone retrieve whatever incriminating evidence exists before investigators find it. And he's stupid enough to discuss it on a recorded jail line, so confident in his own cleverness that he doesn't consider the possibility that detectives might be listening to every word. But here's the thing about this investigation that frustrated everyone following the case. Despite the phone calls, despite the text messages, despite the pattern of sexual abuse, and the clear motive to silence Ziyah before her pregnancy exposed him, prosecutors didn't charge Jarvis, Butts immediately. Weeks became months. The community held vigils for Ziyah, posted her picture on social media, begged for information about her whereabouts. And Jarvis sat in jail on the sexual assault charges involving other victims, but not on anything related to Ziyah. The reason was stark and difficult for Ziyah's family to accept. Her body had never been found. Without a body, without physical evidence of death, murder charges are incredibly difficult to prosecute. Defense attorneys can argue that the victim ran away, that they're alive somewhere, and simply haven't been found. Juries raised on CSI and true crime documentaries expect forensic evidence, expect the prosecution to prove beyond a reasonable doubt not just that a murder occurred, but that the defendant committed it. And in a case where the victim's body might never be recovered, that burden feels almost impossible. So prosecutors waited. They built the sexual assault cases against Jarvis Butts with the other young victims, cases that had physical evidence and testimony, and all the elements needed for conviction. They worked the Ziyah investigation quietly, following leads, analyzing cell tower data, interviewing witnesses, building a circumstantial case strong enough that they felt confident bringing murder charges, even without a body. On September 27, 2024, 8 months and 18 days after Ziyah vanished, the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office finally announced charges. Jarvis Butts was charged with second-degree murder, felony murder, and multiple counts of criminal sexual conduct related to Ziyah Harris. The community erupted in relief and rage. relief that finally someone was being held accountable, rage that it had taken so long, rage that the charges were second-degree murder instead of first. Because here's what second-degree murder means. It's a killing that happens without premeditation, in the heat of passion, or during the commission of another felony. First-degree murder requires proof that the killing was planned, deliberate, thought out in advance. And prosecutors, looking at the evidence they had, decided they couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Jarvis Butts planned to kill Ziyah before he did it. Maybe it was a spontaneous decision when she told him about the pregnancy. Maybe it happened during an argument. Maybe he didn't intend to kill her, but did something that resulted in her death, and then disposed of her body. The family heard second-degree murder and felt the justice system had already failed Ziyah before the trial even started. Because they knew, everyone who understood this case knew, that Jarvis Butts had been systematically grooming and abusing Ziyah for years. They knew that when she became pregnant, she became a liability that could destroy his life. They knew that her disappearance wasn't spontaneous, wasn't heat of passion, wasn't anything except a calculated decision to eliminate a problem. But knowing something and proving it in court are different things. And as the months passed and the case moved toward trial, another fear began to consume the family. What if he's acquitted? What if a jury looks at the circumstantial evidence, no body, no witnesses, no forensic proof of death, and decides the prosecution hasn't met its burden? What if Jarvis Butts walks free? That fear is what makes plea deals so devastating and so necessary. Because prosecutors knew something else the family didn't want to accept. Without Ziyah's body, this case was risky. A good defense attorney could create reasonable doubt. They could argue that Ziyah ran away, that she's alive somewhere, that Jarvis's suspicious behavior was just a man panicking about the sexual assault charges and trying to distance himself from a missing girl he'd been accused of abusing. They could put expert witnesses on the stand who testify that it's impossible to prove murder without a body. They could attack every piece of circumstantial evidence until a jury starts to wonder if maybe, possibly, there's another explanation. And if a jury acquits Jarvis Butts of murder, he can never be charged again. Double jeopardy means he walks away forever, even if Ziyah's body is found the next day with his DNA all over it. An acquittal is final, absolute, devastating. So prosecutors made a calculation. They approached Jarvis Butts' defense team with a plea deal. Plead guilty to second-degree murder and the sexual assault charges, agree to provide truthful information about Ziyah's body, and avoid the possibility of life in prison. In exchange, we'll withdraw the habitual offender enhancement that would have added a mandatory 25 years. We'll let all the sentences run concurrent instead of consecutive. We'll give you a chance, however small, however distant, at eventual freedom. For Ziyah's family, the plea deal felt like a betrayal. 35 to 60 years, with all sentences running concurrent, meaning Jarvis could theoretically be eligible for parole in his 70s. It felt like the justice system valuing a predator's life over a murdered child's. It felt like the final insult in a series of failures that began the first time an adult looked the other way while Jarvis Butts groomed Ziyah and ended with her body still missing, still unfound, still denied the dignity of a proper burial. But here's the complexity that makes this case so painful. The plea deal might be the only way Ziyah's family ever gets answers. Because part of the agreement, the part that sparked the most controversy and confusion, is that Jarvis Butts must provide truthful statement regarding the body of Ziyah Harris. Read that language carefully. It doesn't say he has to reveal the location of her body. It doesn't say he has to lead police to her remains. It says he has to provide a truthful statement regarding her body. And people are furious about that ambiguity because it feels like a loophole big enough for a predator to slip through. What constitutes a truthful statement? Can he just say, "I don't remember where I put her," and claim he's fulfilled the requirement? Can he describe what he did without actually making it possible to recover her remains? The prosecutors who negotiated this deal would argue that the vague language was necessary to get Jarvis to agree to anything at all. His defense attorneys knew that the exact location of Ziyah's body was the only real leverage he had left. They weren't going to let him give that up without getting something significant in return, like avoiding a life sentence. So the compromise was this language that obligates him to tell some version of the truth while leaving room for interpretation about what that truth has to include. For the family, it's unbearable. They want Ziyah's body. They want to bury her, to have a grave to visit, to give her the funeral she deserves. They want the concrete proof that she's dead, that their worst fears are confirmed, so they can stop existing in the liminal space of knowing she's gone but having no evidence, no closure, no end to the nightmare. And they want Jarvis Butts to suffer the way they're suffering. They want him to die in prison, to never experience freedom again, to spend every remaining day of his life locked in a cage, knowing that he destroyed a child and ruined countless lives. 35 to 60 years doesn't feel like enough. The possibility that he might someday walk free, even if he's old, even if he's broken, even if decades have passed, feels like injustice, so profound it makes the concept of a justice system feel like a sick joke. But prosecutors faced an impossible choice. Take the case to trial and risk acquittal, or accept a plea deal that guarantees prison time and potentially gives the family information about Ziyah's body. When you frame it that way, when you acknowledge the very real possibility that a jury might not convict without physical evidence, the plea deal starts to look less like a failure and more like the best bad option in a situation with no good ones. The court hearing where Jarvis Butts entered his plea was devastating to witness, even through the filter of official transcripts and news reports. Annette Harris, Ziyah's grandmother and adoptive mother, gave a victim impact statement that should be required reading for anyone who wants to understand what this case has done to the people who loved Ziyah. She talked about grooming, about mind games, about a predator who controlled a child emotionally until she thought of him as bae for life, saved in her phone contacts that way, a designation that makes you want to vomit when you understand what it really represents. Not a loving relationship between equals, but a child so thoroughly manipulated that she believed her abuser loved her. She talked about the text messages that were read in court, messages so disturbing that hearing them felt like a violation. A 41-year-old man and a 13-year-old girl discussing pregnancy tests and having a relationship that everyone knew was wrong, but nobody stopped. She talked about Ziyah being exposed to adult situations at an age when she should have been protected, sheltered, allowed to be a child. And then Annette said something that cuts to the heart of this case. She deserved love from her parents and everyone who was in her life. She was ignored. She was neglected. And you took complete advantage of that. Because that's the truth that makes Ziyah's murder about more than just one predator. Jarvis Butts is a monster. Nobody disputes that. But he operated in an environment that made his monstrosity possible. Ziyah was a child falling through every crack in the system designed to protect her. Her biological parents couldn't care for her. Her extended family was fractured and chaotic. The systems that are supposed to catch vulnerable children, schools, social services, community organizations, never identified her as a victim until it was too late. And critically, Jarvis Butts was a known sex offender with access to children. He wasn't hiding his presence in Ziyah's life. He was there openly, hiring neighborhood kids, positioning himself as a mentor, being welcomed into family spaces despite being on a registry that exists specifically to warn communities about predators like him. People knew he was a sex offender. And they let him around children anyway.
Why?
Because sex offender registries in America have become so broad, so all-encompassing, that they include everything from violent child rapists to teenagers who had consensual sex with other teenagers to people who urinated in public. The registry lost its meaning through overuse, stopped being a bright red warning sign, and became background noise that people tuned out. Jarvis Butts was on the registry, sure, but maybe his offense wasn't that bad? Maybe he deserved a second chance? Maybe it was wrong to judge him forever for something in his past. This kind of thinking, this benefit of the doubt mentality that prioritizes adult men's reputations over children's safety, is how predators like Jarvis Butts gain access to victims. Because we're more comfortable assuming the best about adults we know than accepting the uncomfortable truth that someone familiar, someone helpful, someone who seems kind could be a monster. The judge, in accepting Jarvis's plea, acknowledged this broader failure. She talked about the case being a prime example of how much work we have to do when it comes to protecting our children, and especially our Black girls. Because Nazia's blackness mattered in how her disappearance was handled, how quickly resources were deployed, how much media attention the case received. A missing white girl from the suburbs becomes a national news story within hours. A missing black girl from Detroit took months to generate significant media coverage, even after prosecutors charged someone with her murder. This disparity isn't accidental. It's the result of systemic racism that devalues black children's lives, that views black girls as less innocent and less deserving of protection than their white counterparts. Studies have shown that adults perceive black girls as older, more mature, and less in need of nurturing than white girls of the same age. This adultification means that when black girls are victimized, people are less likely to see them as victims and more likely to view them as participants in their own abuse. Ziyah was 13 years old, a child by any definition, regardless of race. But the systems that should have protected her failed to see her as a child who needed saving. They saw her as a troubled kid from a troubled family in a troubled neighborhood, just another statistic in a city struggling with poverty and crime and all the social ills that make vulnerable people even more vulnerable. And Jarvis Butts, reading those systems perfectly, knew that Ziyah was a victim nobody was watching closely enough to save. He knew that he could groom her, abuse her, impregnate her, and as long as he maintained his facade of being a helpful community member, nobody would question his access to her. He was right. Until he wasn't. Until Ziyah disappeared and her absence finally made people look closely at what had been happening in plain sight all along. The plea deal Jarvis accepted includes multiple components beyond just the murder charge. He pleaded guilty to 6 charges total: second-degree murder for Ziyah, 4 counts of second-degree criminal sexual conduct, and 1 count of third-degree criminal sexual conduct. These sexual assault charges involve other young victims, girls who came forward after Ziyah disappeared and told investigators about their own experiences with Jarvis Butts, experiences that followed the same pattern as what he did to Ziyah. Each of those victims deserves recognition as survivors, as humans who endured trauma and found the courage to speak about it. But in the plea agreement, their cases became leverage, additional charges that gave prosecutors more bargaining power when negotiating with Jarvis's defense team, and additional sentences that would run concurrent with the murder charge, meaning he wouldn't serve extra time for their victimization. For those girls and their families, the concurrent sentencing feels like their trauma being minimized, treated as less important than the murder charge, worthy of being bundled together rather than punished separately. It's another way the justice system fails victims in pursuit of prosecutorial efficiency, another compromise that makes sense in terms of legal strategy, but feels devastating in terms of moral accountability. The total sentence Jarvis Butts faces under the plea agreement is 35 to 60 years, all to be served concurrently. At minimum, if he serves every day of his minimum sentence without early release, he'll be 76 years old when he's eligible for parole. At maximum, if he serves the full 60 years, he'll be 101. The practical reality is that he'll likely die in prison, but likely isn't certain, and the small possibility that he could someday breathe free air while Ziyah remains buried in an unknown location is what haunts her family. The habitual offender enhancement that prosecutors withdrew as part of the plea deal would have added a mandatory 25 years to his sentence. That enhancement applied because Jarvis was already a convicted sex offender when he committed the crimes against Ziyah and the other victims. He wasn't just a first-time offender who made a terrible mistake. He was a repeat predator whose previous conviction should have been a warning to everyone and a flag in the system. But withdrawing that enhancement was necessary to get Jarvis to plead guilty, prosecutors argued. His defense attorneys knew that the murder case without a body was risky for the prosecution, knew that the sexual assault cases would be difficult with child witnesses who'd been traumatized and might struggle on the stand, knew that their best chance at avoiding a life sentence was negotiating a plea before trial. So they leveraged every advantage they had, and prosecutors made the calculation that guaranteed prison time was better than the risk of acquittal. For people watching this case from outside, the plea deal raises uncomfortable questions about what justice actually means. Is it about punishment, making the guilty suffer proportionally to the harm they caused? Is it about protection, keeping dangerous people away from society for as long as possible? Is it about closure, giving victims' families answers and the ability to move forward? Is it about accountability, forcing perpetrators to admit what they did and accept responsibility. The plea deal in Ziyah's case arguably achieves some of these goals. Jarvis Butts will spend decades in prison, probably the rest of his life. He had to admit under oath that he murdered Ziyah Harris and sexually assaulted multiple other children. He's obligated to provide information about Ziyah's body, even if the language is frustratingly vague about what that means. He'll never again have the opportunity to groom and abuse children the way he did for years before his arrest. But it fails other measures of justice just as completely. The punishment feels insufficient for the crime. 13-year-old Ziyah's entire future stolen, and her murderer gets the possibility of parole? The closure is incomplete. Her family might never find her body, might never be able to bury her properly, might spend the rest of their lives wondering where she is. The accountability is partial. Jarvis entered an Alford plea to some charges, meaning he accepted punishment while maintaining he didn't commit the crime, a legal fiction that lets defendants avoid full admission of guilt. And perhaps most devastatingly, the plea deal reveals that the justice system values certainty over righteousness. Prosecutors weren't willing to risk trial because they knew conviction wasn't guaranteed, so they accepted a compromise that guarantees some punishment rather than gambling on the possibility of maximum punishment. That's practical. That's smart legal strategy. That's how prosecutors protect their conviction rates and ensure that dangerous people go to prison. But it's also an admission that justice, real justice, the kind that feels right in your bones, is often impossible within the constraints of the legal system. The law requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It requires following procedural rules, even when they protect the guilty. It requires making strategic decisions based on probability rather than moral clarity. And sometimes that means accepting outcomes that feel wrong because the alternative is worse. Ziyah's family understands this intellectually, but that doesn't make it easier to accept emotionally. They wanted Jarvis Butts to die in prison with absolute certainty. They wanted him to suffer the way they're suffering. They wanted the world to know exactly what he did and see him punished to the fullest extent possible. The plea deal gives them some of that, but not all of it, and the gap between what they deserved and what they got is where their grief lives permanently now. The community response to the plea deal has been mixed, which itself reveals something important about how we process justice in high-profile cases. Some people are relieved that Jarvis Butts will definitely go to prison for decades, that he admitted his guilt, that Ziyah's name is formally attached to his conviction, so her memory isn't erased. Others are furious that he avoided a life sentence, that the sexual assault charges run concurrent instead of consecutive, that he might theoretically someday be paroled. Social media erupted with both reactions, people arguing about whether this was the best possible outcome or a failure of the justice system. The debate often split along lines of legal knowledge. Lawyers and people familiar with the criminal justice system tended to view the plea as a reasonable compromise given the challenges of prosecuting a murder without a body, while people less familiar with how the system actually works saw it as an unacceptable capitulation to a child murderer. Both perspectives have validity. The legal realities that made prosecutors offer a plea deal are real. Without Ziyah's body, conviction at trial was genuinely uncertain, and an acquittal would have been catastrophically unjust. But the emotional reality that this outcome feels inadequate is equally real. Ziyah deserved better than to be reduced to a line item in a plea agreement, her murder worth only 35 years minimum, her body's location a negotiating point rather than a non-negotiable requirement. And hovering over all of this is the question that the plea agreement supposedly addresses, but might never actually answer. Where is Ziyah Harris? What did Jarvis Butts do with her body? Can she ever be found and properly laid to rest? The requirement that Jarvis provide truthful statement regarding the body of Ziyah Harris is supposed to answer that question, but the vague language has people worried. What if he says he doesn't remember where he disposed of her body? What if he describes what he did in general terms, but can't or won't provide specific enough information to actually locate her remains? What if he provides information that leads to searches that turn up nothing, and then claims he told the truth but the body has been moved or destroyed by natural processes? Legal experts watching the case have noted that the plea agreement should include consequences if Jarvis fails to fulfill this requirement. Theoretically, prosecutors could withdraw from the deal if he doesn't provide substantive information about Ziyah's body. But proving that he's withholding information versus genuinely not remembering or not being able to provide useful details is almost impossible. And once the plea is entered and accepted by the court, withdrawing from it becomes incredibly complicated legally. This ambiguity is strategic on the defense's part and potentially devastating for Ziyah's family. Because recovering her body isn't just about closure, though that would be meaningful. It's also about evidence. A body can tell investigators exactly how Ziyah died, whether she was strangled, beaten, shot, poisoned. It can provide forensic evidence that might corroborate or contradict Jarvis's account of what happened. It can answer questions that the family has lived with for over 2 years. And on a more fundamental level, a body is a person's final resting place, the physical remains that represent their existence in the world. Every religion and culture has rituals around death, around honoring the dead, around laying them to rest with dignity. Ziyah's family has been denied that. They can't hold a funeral with her body present. They can't visit her grave. They can't have the concrete finality that a burial provides. Jarvis Butts knows this. He knows that the location of Ziyah's body is the last bit of power he has over her family, the last way he can hurt them, the last bargaining chip he possesses. And the plea agreement's vague language gives him room to use that power however he chooses. There's a possibility, one that keeps Ziyah's family up at night, that he'll never tell them where she is. That he'll provide some version of a statement that technically fulfills his legal obligation while still keeping her body's location secret. That he'll take that information to his grave, ensuring that even after he's dead and gone, his final act of cruelty toward Ziyah and her family continues indefinitely. That's the kind of evil that's hard to comprehend if you haven't encountered it directly. Most people, even people who've done terrible things, have some line they won't cross, some shred of humanity that prevents absolute cruelty. But predators like Jarvis Butts don't have that line. They've spent so long dehumanizing their victims, viewing them as objects to be used rather than people with inherent worth, that even in their final opportunities to show remorse or provide comfort to grieving families, they choose continued cruelty. The judge who sentenced Jarvis understood this when she described him as the monster in this whole picture. Because that's what he is, not a person who made a terrible mistake, not someone redeemable through punishment and rehabilitation, but a predator who systematically destroyed children's lives and shows no genuine remorse for the damage he caused. In her victim impact statement, Annette Harris said something that captures the horror of men like Jarvis Butts. "You groomed. You played mind games with her. We all heard that you controlled her emotionally. This is what predators do. They don't just commit individual acts of abuse. They create entire psychological frameworks that trap their victims, make them feel complicit, make them believe that what's happening is normal or deserved or even wanted." Ziyah saved Jarvis and her phone as bae for life. A 13-year-old child, who should have been saving boys her own age with silly nicknames, instead had her 41-year-old abuser listed as her lifelong love. That's not a relationship. That's psychological torture. That's a child so thoroughly manipulated that she couldn't recognize the difference between love and abuse, between a healthy relationship and predation. And the most devastating part is that Ziyah likely died still believing that Jarvis cared about her. She probably didn't understand, even in her final moments, that she was being killed because she had become inconvenient, because her pregnancy threatened to expose him, because he valued his freedom more than her life. She probably thought he loved her right up until the moment he ended her life. That's the part that makes this case unbearable, not just that a child was murdered, but that she was murdered by someone she trusted, someone she thought cared about her, someone who had spent years making her believe that his attention was special and valuable. The betrayal is so complete, so absolute, that it almost overshadows the murder itself. The other victims of Jarvis Butts carry their own versions of this betrayal. The girls who testified about his sexual abuse described similar patterns. He befriended them, made them feel special, gave them money and attention, and then violated them while maintaining that this was normal, this was okay, This was what people who cared about each other did. Some of those victims are still processing what happened to them. Child sexual abuse has lifelong impacts on victims' mental health, their ability to form healthy relationships, their sense of safety in the world. They'll carry the trauma of what Jarvis did to them for the rest of their lives, even as he sits in prison and eventually dies. His punishment ends. Their suffering doesn't. This is what people mean when they say that sex offenders destroy lives even after they're caught. The damage they cause ripples outward infinitely. Victims who struggle with PTSD, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, relationship problems. Families torn apart by the revelation of abuse and the divisions it creates between people who believe victims and people who protect abusers. Communities that have to reckon with the fact that a predator operated among them for years while people looked away. Detroit is grappling with this reckoning now. How did Jarvis Butts abuse children for years without being stopped? How many adults knew or suspected something was wrong but didn't intervene? How many times did someone notice something off about his interactions with young girls and explain it away because he was family, because he seemed helpful, because confronting a potential predator is uncomfortable and risky? These are the questions that communities don't want to ask because the answers implicate all of us. We create the conditions that allow predators to operate by prioritizing adult comfort over child safety, by giving people the benefit of the doubt when red flags appear, by treating accusations of abuse with skepticism rather than taking them seriously and investigating thoroughly. And we create the conditions that make certain children particularly vulnerable: children from chaotic families, children who are neglected or ignored, children who are hungry for attention and affection because the adults in their lives aren't providing it consistently. Predators seek out these children specifically because they're easy to manipulate, because offering them the attention and care they're not getting at home creates a powerful bond that can be exploited. Ziyah was exactly this kind of vulnerable child. She was being raised by her grandmother because her parents couldn't care for her, already a marker of instability and potential trauma. Her family system was complicated and fractured, with multiple adults cycling in and out of her life. She craved attention and connection, the normal developmental need of a teenager amplified by the instability of her childhood. Jarvis Butts recognized her vulnerability and exploited it systematically. He provided the attention she craved, made her feel important and valued, filled the gaps left by the adults who should have been caring for her. And when she became dependent on that attention, when she would do anything to keep receiving it, he began sexually abusing her. This pattern is how most child sexual abuse happens. Not stranger danger, not kidnappings by unknown predators, but grooming by people the child knows and trusts. Family members, family friends, coaches, teachers, mentors, religious leaders. People who have legitimate access to children and who use that access to identify and exploit vulnerable victims. Understanding this pattern is crucial for preventing future cases like Ziyah's. We need to stop teaching children that adults deserve automatic respect and obedience, and start teaching them that they have the right to set boundaries even with adults they know. We need to stop assuming that people with good reputations couldn't possibly be abusers, and start taking accusations seriously regardless of who they implicate. We need to stop creating environments where predators can isolate children without oversight, and start building systems of accountability and transparency. And critically, we need to support vulnerable families so their children aren't targeted by predators in the first place. Ziyah's family was struggling, financially, emotionally, practically. If they'd had better access to resources, to support systems, to mental health care and family services, maybe Ziyah wouldn't have been so hungry for attention that Jarvis Butts could exploit her so easily. Maybe she would have had enough stability and security in her life that his grooming tactics wouldn't have worked. This isn't about blaming Ziyah's family for her murder. Jarvis Butts is solely responsible for what he did to her. But it is about recognizing that child abuse prevention requires more than just punishing abusers after the fact. It requires creating social conditions where children are protected, where families have the resources they need to care for their kids, where vulnerable children are identified and supported before predators can exploit them. The judge in Ziyah's case said that it's a prime example of how much work we have to do when it comes to protecting our children, and especially our Black girls. That work includes everything from better funding for child protective services to community education about grooming and abuse, from supporting struggling families to holding institutions accountable when they fail to protect children in their care. It includes confronting the racism that makes Black girls' victimization less visible and less prioritized than white girls. It includes changing the cultural narratives that adultify Black girls and view them as less innocent, less deserving of protection, more responsible for their own abuse. It includes demanding that missing Black children receive the same resources and media attention as missing white children, that their cases are investigated with the same urgency and thoroughness. Ziyah Harris deserved all of that protection and didn't receive it. She deserved a safe childhood, adults who recognized her vulnerability and stepped in to help, systems that identified Jarvis Butts as a threat and kept him away from her. She deserved to grow up, to become the person she might have been if her life hadn't been stolen at 13. And now she deserves justice, real justice, complete justice, justice that feels adequate to the life that was taken and the suffering she endured. The plea deal doesn't provide that. It provides legal accountability, practical punishment, the guarantee that Jarvis Butts will spend decades in prison. But it doesn't provide the justice her family wanted, the justice that feels right, the justice that would somehow make sense of this senseless tragedy. Because here's the truth about cases like this. Justice, in any meaningful sense, is impossible. No punishment can bring Ziyah back. No sentence can undo the abuse she suffered or the terror of her final moments. No amount of prison time can restore what was stolen from her or heal the damage done to everyone who loved her. The best we can do is hold perpetrators accountable, prevent them from hurting anyone else, and hopefully deter others who might be contemplating similar crimes. The plea deal achieves those goals imperfectly. Jarvis Butts will probably die in prison. He can't abuse any more children. And his prosecution sends a message to other predators that even without a body, even without perfect evidence, they can still be caught and punished for murdering children they've groomed. But for Ziyah's family, those practical outcomes don't touch the grief, the rage, the permanent wound of losing her. They live every day knowing that she should be here, should be 15 years old, and worried about homework and basketball and teenage drama. They live every day knowing that a man they trusted destroyed her and might never tell them where her body is. They live every day with the injustice of a plea deal that feels inadequate and a justice system that couldn't deliver the punishment they believe he deserves. The question that haunts this case, the question that should haunt all of us, is how many other Ziyahs are out there right now? How many children are being groomed by predators that their families trust? How many young girls are pregnant by adult men and too scared or manipulated to tell anyone? How many communities are missing the signs of abuse happening in plain sight? The answer is too many. The answer is that child sexual abuse is epidemic, that most of it goes unreported, that most perpetrators are never held accountable. The answer is that for every Jarvis Butts who gets caught and prosecuted, there are dozens more who operate for decades without consequence, destroying child after child while maintaining respectable facades. And the only way to change that is for all of us to become less comfortable, less willing to look away, less invested in assuming the best about adults, and more committed to protecting children. It means believing victims when they disclose abuse, even when it's inconvenient or implicates people we like. It means paying attention to red flags even when it's easier to explain them away. It means creating communities where children feel safe reporting abuse, and where adults respond to those reports with immediate protective action rather than skepticism or denial. It means recognizing that predators are often charming, helpful, well-liked people who've built reputations specifically to deflect suspicion. It means understanding that grooming is a process, not a single event, and that by the time abuse is obvious, a predator has usually been manipulating their victim for months or years. It means accepting that preventing child abuse requires vigilance, discomfort, and the willingness to intervene even when we're not 100% certain something wrong is happening. Ziyah Harris didn't get that protection. She got adults who looked away, who missed signs, who allowed a registered sex offender to have unsupervised access to children because it was easier than confronting him. She got a community where a predator could operate openly, hiring neighborhood kids and positioning himself as a mentor while sexually abusing them. And when she became pregnant and he killed her to hide his crime, she got a justice system that took 8 months to charge him, that couldn't find her body, that had to offer a plea deal because proving murder without remains is so difficult. She got prosecutors who made practical strategic decisions rather than fighting for maximum punishment. She got concurrent sentences and ambiguous language about providing information regarding her body that might never actually lead to her being found. That's the system that's supposed to protect children and deliver justice when they're harmed. And while the people working within that system, the prosecutors, the investigators, the judges, are doing their best within legal and practical constraints, the outcomes they can deliver are often inadequate to the crimes they're addressing. This is what I can't stop thinking about. Ziyah Harris lived 13 years. Jarvis Butts spent probably 2 to 3 of those years grooming and abusing her before he killed her. So roughly 15 to 20% of her entire existence was defined by this predator's crimes against her. And the justice system's response is a sentence that gives him the possibility of freedom someday, that lets his sexual assaults of other victims run concurrent rather than adding decades to his punishment, that might never even recover her body. The math doesn't work. The proportionality isn't there. And no amount of legal expertise or strategic thinking can make it feel right to the people who loved Ziyah and are left to live with her absence for the rest of their lives. So where does that leave us? What do we do with the rage and grief and helplessness that cases like this generate? How do we process living in a world where 13-year-old girls can be groomed, raped, impregnated, and murdered by men their families trust, and the justice system's response is a plea deal that lets the murderer potentially die a free man in his 90s? I don't have good answers to those questions. I don't think anyone does. Because the truth is that justice, real, complete, satisfying justice, is often impossible. The legal system can deliver accountability and punishment, but it can't restore what was lost. It can't bring Ziyah back. It can't undo the trauma inflicted on Jarvis Butts' other victims. It can't heal the community's wound or resolve the moral questions this case raises. What we can do is refuse to look away. We can say Ziyah Harris's name and remember that she was a real child with dreams and personality and a future that was stolen. We can recognize the systemic failures that made her vulnerable and work to address them so fewer children are left unprotected. We can support organizations that combat child sexual abuse, that provide resources to struggling families, that advocate for missing children, especially missing Black children whose cases don't get the attention they deserve. We can examine our own behavior and be honest about the times we've looked away from uncomfortable possibilities, the times we've given adults the benefit of the doubt at children's expense, the times we've prioritized social comfort over child safety. We can commit to doing better, to being the adults who notice and intervene, who believe children when they disclose abuse, who create environments where predators can't operate freely. And we can refuse to let Ziyah Harris be forgotten, reduced to a statistic or a cautionary tale. She was a person. She loved doing hair and fashion and probably had hopes for who she'd become someday. She deserved to live long enough to figure out who that person would be. She deserved safety and protection and the chance to survive her childhood and grow into whoever she was meant to be. Jarvis Butts took all of that from her. The plea deal he accepted is the justice system's response to that theft, imperfect, inadequate, but the best outcome available given the constraints of law and evidence. And Ziyah's family has to live with that outcome, has to find a way to survive the knowledge that the man who murdered their child might someday breathe free air while she remains buried in an unknown location, denied even the dignity of a proper grave. If that makes you angry, good. Be angry. Rage against a world where this happens, where children are vulnerable and predators exploit them and justice systems can't fully address the harm. But don't let the anger consume you. Channel it into something protective, something proactive, something that might prevent the next Ziyah from being groomed and abused and killed. Because somewhere tonight, there's another child in a situation like Ziyah's. There's another family struggling, another vulnerable girl hungry for attention, another predator identifying his next victim. And the only thing that might save that child is adults who pay attention, who intervene, who refuse to look away even when it's uncomfortable. The plea deal in Ziyah Harris's case is now final. Jarvis Butts will spend 35 to 60 years in prison. He's supposed to provide information about her body, though whether that will actually happen remains uncertain. Her family continues to grieve, continues to fight for answers, continues to wake up every day in a world that contains Ziyah's absence. And the rest of us have a choice about what we do with this story. We can consume it like entertainment, shake our heads at the tragedy, and move on to the next true crime case that captures our attention. Or we can let it change us, challenge us, make us more vigilant, and more willing to protect vulnerable children even when it requires discomfort or confrontation. I know which choice I'm making. I know that every time I encounter a situation where a child might be at risk, I'll remember Ziyah Harris and the adults who didn't protect her. I'll remember that looking away is easier, but that intervention might save a life. I'll remember that predators are often charming and well-liked, and that my comfort matters less than a child's safety. What's your choice? Where's your line between minding your own business and speaking up? Between giving adults the benefit of the doubt and protecting children? Between comfort and courage? Ziyah Harris can't answer those questions herself. She can't tell you what she wishes the adults in her life had done differently, what warning signs they missed, what moment might have changed everything. But her absence asks those questions anyway. And how you answer them, how all of us answer them, determines whether future Ziyahs get the protection she deserved. This case will stay with me. The injustice of a 35-year minimum sentence for a man who groomed, raped, and murdered a 13-year-old girl. The ambiguity of plea deal language that might never actually lead to recovering her body. The systemic failures that let a registered sex offender have unsupervised access to children. The racism that made her disappearance less urgent in the eyes of media and systems than a white child's would have been. All of it matters. All of it demands our attention and our commitment to doing better. Not just for Ziyah, whose justice will always feel incomplete, but for every child who's vulnerable right now, every potential victim who could still be saved if adults choose protection over comfort. That's the legacy Ziyah Harris deserves. Not to be forgotten. Not to be reduced to a true crime story people consume for entertainment, but to be remembered as a child who deserved better and whose case should make all of us more committed to protecting the children who are still here, still vulnerable, still depending on adults to keep them safe. If this case moved you, if it made you angry or heartbroken or determined to be more vigilant, then let that emotion drive action. Support organizations that combat child sexual abuse. Educate yourself about grooming tactics so you can recognize them. Believe children who disclose abuse. Create communities where predators can't operate freely. And say her name, Ziyah Harris. She lived. She mattered. She deserved the childhood and future that Jarvis Butts stole from her. And while justice in any complete sense is impossible, the least we can do is remember her, honor her memory, and work to ensure that fewer children suffer what she endured. Because somewhere tonight, another predator is identifying another victim. Another vulnerable child is being groomed by someone their family trusts. Another tragedy is unfolding that might still be prevented if someone pays attention and intervenes. Will you be that someone? Or will you look away like the adults in Ziyah's life did, leaving another child to face a monster alone? The choice is yours. But the stakes are a child's life. And that's a weight we all need to carry if we want to live in a world where children like Ziyah Harris are protected instead of sacrificed to adults' comfort and predators' evil.